Our service is going a little long, so we're going to skip the reading. It was just one more reinforcement of the theme we've been weaving for the last couple of weeks. The theme of how we take stories and integrate them into our lives. In the spirit of Yom Kippur, Kurt Vonnegut once said, "A saint is a person who behaves decently in a shockingly indecent society." Well, I mean, that's the kind of world we have to face. It's not perfect. It's far from it, and there are lots of problems. And somehow we've got to take the stories we hear and the stories of our own lives, like we heard last week, and weave them together in a way that helps give meaning to these existences that we personally have. I'm particularly affected by the stories of our UU faith, because it's a faith that I believe gives us a model of how we should approach life, and it's been doing so for a long time, over 400 years in Europe and back to colonial times in this country. But I'd like to begin with somebody here in the present, a good guy Republican named David Brooks. Most of you have heard David Brooks on public television, and he's written some marvelous things, including his latest book, which is called The Road to Character. In that book, Brooks talks about the differences between resumes and eulogies. Resumes, you know what those are. They're the pieces of paper on which we put down all the sorts of experiences and skills we think will land us some kind of job or something else that we want. They're sort of what we've been able to do outwardly with our lives. Eulogies are very different. They're like those things we want on that page of ours in the book of life. The sorts of things we'd like to have said about us when finally it's our time to leave this earth and to have our lives come to an end. They describe things like, I would hope, kindness and wisdom and connectedness and honesty and courage. But Brooks says, unfortunately, these days, far too many of us spend time trying to build up our resumes instead of developing the kind of virtues that would exemplify character, creating the sort of person at our core we really want to be. Developing such virtues has also been central to the message of Unitarian Universalism all along. We've always held out as models the kinds of virtuous people talked about in the stories last week, or Uncle Jed in that story this morning. That's at the heart of the Jewish holy days as well, as people confess their sins and try to atone for them and to write a better page for themselves on the book of life. A couple of years ago, I had the privilege of being asked to preach the ordination sermon for a former student of mine who was being ordained by the Unitarian Universalist Church in Baltimore, Maryland. I delivered the sermon in the church in which William Ellery Channing preached the sermon at another ordination, this one in 1819. It's the sermon many believe launched Unitarianism in this country. And in that sermon, Channing spelled the notion out of a unified God and the human responsibility that went with following the gospel of God's great prophet, Jesus. At the center of Channing's theology was not a recitation of a creed or performing rituals. It was the belief that Jesus, rather than being divine, was a person whose life, beyond that of all others, exemplified virtues that could lead a person into living a goodly, by which he meant a godly life. And he talked about that in an essay called Self-Culture. In that essay, Channing talks about the character of a goodly life, the kind of life that he said would make one into a religious person. He said the character of such a person has nothing to do with a person's sphere, that is, where they stand in life. It doesn't lie in the magnitude of a person's outward agency, in the extent of the effects a person produces. Grandeur of character lies wholly in the force of soul, that is, in the force of thought, of moral principle, and above all, of love. And this may be found in the humblest conditions of life, like Uncle Jed on his horse, riding around, giving haircuts. The greatest person is the one who chooses the right with invincible resolution, who resists the sorest temptations from within and without, and bears the heaviest burdens cheerfully, who is calmest in storms and most fearless under menace and frowns, whose reliance on truth, on virtue, on God, that is, whatever it is that's most ultimate and trustworthy, is unfaltering. And Channing says, those are the qualities of a person of good character. And being a person of good character, he said, is the ground of human responsibility. This, he said, rather than rituals and creeds, needs to be the focus of religion, for it's what makes us moral. Character comes from an inner voice that calls us to revere and exercise impartial justice and universal goodwill. Being a person like this is religious, said Channing, because it comes from an inner voice that is a reflection of whatever it is that is most transcendent. And it's intellectual, because it's based on insight and reason and a quest for truth. And it's social, in that it comes from a recognition that we can't live alone. And it's practical, because it provides us with the best way of live. And finally, it's personal, because it calls on us to make use of whatever gifts we have in whatever situations in which we find ourselves. In building character, says Channing, our greatest danger isn't from the grossly wicked among us, but from the worldly, unreflecting multitude who are borne along as a stream of foreign impulse and bear us along with them. It's as though Channing had been warning us against listening, if you'll excuse my bias, to Fox News. In what he writes, it's as though David Brooks was a disciple of Channing, although I know he's not a Unitarian Universalist. But like Channing, he's worried about what he sees today as a shift away from developing lives of character to giving in to the lure of a culture that encourages people to see themselves as being at the center of the universe. He calls it the big me. A universe they believe they're entitled to manipulate in their own interests no matter what. In doing this, he says, what people forget is that they're fallible and hurtful, and because of this and because of what they do, they often end up unhappy. After all, look at all the unattainable things we're flooded with on those commercials that happen every 4 minutes on television. Sex, drugs, and alcohol. Oh yeah, I forgot that ultimate symbol of success and sex called the automobile. What people seem to forget is that it's not things that really bring us happiness. And happiness isn't something that's isolated from our relationship with other people. Many of the stories in our world's varied religious traditions remind us of this. They all have a statement about a concern for others at the center of their message. In our religious ancestry, people like Channing believed that each of us is born in a covenant with God or life to care not just about ourselves, but about other people and about life itself. That's what the Golden Rule is all about. Our forebears believed that although we sometimes fall short of this goal, that human beings make mistakes. It's part of what it means to be human. We aren't damned by them as long as we can remember to learn from them and then to do something about them. That is, turn to the next page in the book of life and write something new. As it's put in our Unitarian Universalist Statement of Principles and Purposes, we're all creatures of inherent dignity and worth. So we have to behave like it and not give in to doing what's wrong. Dorothy Day is a person Brooks admires because he thinks of her as a person of character, although if you read Dorothy Day's biography, you'll understand that she did some absolutely foolish things when she was a bit younger. But she said after reading Dostoevsky, with stories born out of that dark, poor, cold Russian life of his, she came to believe that only after a hard struggle with sin and only after we've overcome it are we really able to experience blessed joy and peace. The issue, as I said, isn't doing something that's wrong, it's doing something about it. Brooks has a lot to say about this and about how such struggles enrich our lives and about how we can learn by moving through them. And in looking at people who've been successful in doing this, he says that most of them identify with a kind of counterculture, like the counterculture of religion, as did Dorothy Day and certainly did Channing. Says Brooks, to live a decent life, to build up the soul, it's probably necessary to declare that the forces that encourage the culture of radical individualism, the big me, while necessary and liberating in some ways, have gone too far and we've gotten out of balance. To restore the balance, to cultivate the eulogy values, it's necessary to revive and follow what we accidentally left behind, the counter-tradition of moral realism, raising our children with a true sense of who they are and a practical sense of ideas about how to travel along that long road of character. Brooks suggests that to be a person of character, we have to develop what he calls the humility code, a way of living in which, rather than living for happiness, we live for fulfillment. That is, for lives that have meaning and purpose. That we work to understand ourselves deeply. That we work to discover what gifts we have and the flaws with which we have to deal, and to not think that external success means everything, because it doesn't. To realize that our flaws don't have to control us, because we can choose to do something about them. To stop thinking of ourselves as at the center of the universe and realize the connectedness that we have to others and to the rest of life. Let go of the idea that we have to be better than others rather than just being ourselves at our best, whatever that is. You get off the notion that life should always be good to us. Sometimes it just isn't. And we have to pull ourselves together and get on with it. We need to understand that good things can happen without our asking for them, but when they don't, we've got to ask for help, just as we've got to help others when good things don't happen for them. And we must understand, as does that universalist in us, that whatever it is that's most sacred and holy accepts us, just wanting us to have, as Paul Tillich puts it, the courage to be. be who we are at our best. Having said this, let me finish with some words from Channing, who should be a person we are proud of as a forebearer. He didn't believe that to be a person of character was to be somber or sad. In fact, quite the opposite. Said Channing, there's joy in a life that's filled with gratitude and reverence and admiration. There's joy in feeling chosen, obedience to other people and ideas and commitments that are greater than ourselves. There's joys in that feeling of acceptance, the knowledge that though we don't believe we deserve others' love, others still love us. And they admit us into their lives. There's joy to be felt in morally good action, which makes all other joys seem paltry. Joy comes as a gift when we least expect it. At those fleeting moments, you know why you were put here and the truth you serve. You may not feel giddy at those moments. You may not hear the orchestra's delicious swell or see flashes of crimson and gold. But you feel a satisfaction, a silence, a peace, a hush. Those moments are the blessings and the signs of a beautiful life. The blessings Uncle Judd felt sitting there finally in his barber shop.